everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the lecture on magma and igneous rocks. If you haven't seen part 1, be sure to go to YouTube and watch that one first. We left off part 1 lecture by discussing the way that magma is generally categorized based on the amount of SiO2 it contains. That's the principal component of all magmas. Those that contain very high amounts of SiO2, so up to say 0.75% by weight, are called felsic. And those that contain very low amounts of SiO2 by weight are called mafic or ultramafic. And the amount of SiO2 in the magma itself has very important consequences for the way the magma behaves. So those that have really high SiO2 tend to be lower in temperature and have very low density. They also produce igneous rocks that are light in color. So like this one here, this is a felsic rock. In contrast, mafic magmas, those that have very little SiO2, but relatively large amounts of magnesium and iron, tend to have high temperatures, be very dense, and produce igneous rocks that are dark in color, like this one seen here. Mafic magmas, because they are higher in temperature, tend to be very runny or non-viscous, whereas felsic magmas, those that have a lot of SiO2, because they are low temperature, tend to be non-viscous, okay, or more gummy. So why are there so many different kinds of magma? Why is there such variation in the composition of magmas that can exist? There are 4 answers to this question. I'm going to outline them for you now, then we're going to go through them one by one. Well, the first thing is source rock composition. So what gets melted in the first place to produce a magma is very important in terms of the kind of magma or the composition of the magma that gets produced. The second factor that controls magma composition is partial melting. We're going to talk a lot about this one. And when we get together for our live Zoom, we'll look at an animation about that. Third thing is assimilation, or the incorporation of chemicals that are dissolved from surrounding wall rocks. And lastly, magma mixing. So if you take 2 magmas of different composition and you mix them together, you can get a third new composition of magma. So these 4 factors are what provide the huge heterogeneity of magma compositions that exist on planet Earth. Okay, so let's go through them one by one. First, source rock. The composition of a magma reflects the composition of the solid from which it was derived. Okay, so what that means is that whatever you melt is going to produce a magma. And if the source rock, or the thing that you're melting, is different in composition, then the resulting magma also will be. So a mantle source, if you melt or partially melt the Earth's mantle, it will produce ultramafic and mafic magmas. By comparison, if you melt the crust of planet Earth, you tend to produce intermediate to felsic magmas. So you can produce things with different SiO2 contents depending on what you melt. And of course, that is related to the fact that the Earth is differentiated. So the crust of the Earth has different chemicals in it and different minerals, different rocks, than does the mantle. The oceanic crust is different than the continental crust. So whatever it is that you're starting with to melt will have an impact on the magma that's created. Secondly, partial melting. This one is very important. And like I said, we're going to spend some time talking about this together as a group. Partial melting simply refers to the fact that rocks rarely melt completely. In fact, typically only 20 to 30% of a rock melts, sometimes much less than that. So what that means is that only a portion of the rock melts, and it's not just any portion, it's not just random. What happens is that the silicon-rich part of the rock, the pre-existing source rock, melts first. And the silica-poor minerals get left behind in the residue, or another way to think of it is that they melt later. So if you take a rock and you do just a little bit of partial melting to it, so In this picture on the left, we've got a rock that has not been melted at all. So here's our solid rock in kind of microscope view. And now what we're going to do is through some process, we're going to cause it to partially melt. Well, you'll notice that it's not just anything that melts first, it's the felsic material that melts first. Therefore, the melt that gets produced, if it's extracted or kind of slurped out of this rock, will have a very silica-rich or felsic composition. The more you melt, the more mafic the composition becomes because you're starting to increasingly melt the Si poor minerals or the mafic minerals. But regardless, any and every time you partially melt a rock, the resulting liquid or melt will be more silicon rich than the source that you started with. And the lower the percent of partial melting that occurs, the greater that enrichment in SiO2 of the resulting melt. Okay, assimilation. Assimilation refers to the incorporation of wall rocks into the hot magma chamber. Okay, so wall rocks are simply the rocks that are surrounding or the rocks into which the magma is injected. And what happens is that sometimes little bits or blobs of the wall rock might break off and fall into the magma itself, where they are melted and chemically incorporated into the magma. Okay, so that is going to affect the chemistry or the composition of the magma itself. And then lastly, of course, you can have two different magmas that mix together to form a third composition, and there's no figure for that. But I do have a photograph that I took in the field once in British Columbia. So this is a photograph that shows the mixing, and actually this is a better word for it, the mingling of magmas, because it turns out that magmas of different composition, felsic and mafic magmas, they actually don't homogenize and mix together really well to form a third composition like I was describing, because they tend to behave kind of like oil and water because their viscosities are so different and their temperatures are so different. Instead, they tend to mingle. So they are physically occupying the same space, but they haven't really dissolved into one another and created this homogeneous third composition. So in this picture, you can see blebs and blobs of mafic magma. That's all the dark colored stuff, because magnesium and iron-rich magmas and the igneous rocks that they produce tend to be darker in color, containing minerals that are also dark in color. Whereas the felsic bits here are these kind of lighter colored stringers and blobs that wrap around the dark stuff. That's the felsic magma, and it tends to be lighter in color because it contains magnesium and iron poor minerals that are themselves lighter in color. So this is just a field example of two different magmas, a mafic one and a felsic one, mingling with one another. As I was saying before, felsic or high SiO2 lavas or magmas tend to be lower in temperature, tend to be less dense, and also tend to be more viscous. That lower temperature means that you have less energy for breaking bonds and creating kind of a runnier liquid. So because they are more viscous, they tend to form things like these domes, which eventually build up and become so pressurized that they explode in really violent or explosive eruptions. So lava domes or plugs leading to explosive eruptions are characteristic of felsic lavas. In contrast, mafic lava is high in temperature, and so therefore not viscous. We'll call it runny. So viscous is gummy, non-viscous is runny. So mafic, meaning low SiO2, is a high temperature, less viscous or runny lava that also tends to be very dense because it's rich, again, in magnesium and iron. And so therefore, instead of making these plugs that erupt violently, tends to kind of gurgle and flow out of volcanoes, creating these lava fountains and lava flows. So what happens when that lava reaches the surface and starts to cool? Or maybe it's a magma that never made it to the surface, but it got higher and higher into the Earth's crust, where it became cooler and cooler until eventually it started to crystallize. When that happens, minerals start to form. So the chemicals and the molecules that had a lot of energy, heat energy moving around rapidly in the magma, stop bumping around and start to join together to form the crystals that ultimately make minerals. Well, this again doesn't happen just randomly. It is mafic minerals, those that are stable at high temperatures, that start to form first. So it says here in the little caption that early formed crystals are mafic. And those mafic crystals can then sink to the bottom here and form like a kind of a collection of crystals at the bottom here. That means that the remaining liquid, which is, all of this kind of pink stuff around it, becomes relatively felsic. So really all of these processes, partial melting and fractional crystallization, drive the compositions of magmas or melts to more and more felsic compositions. If you were to take a straw and kind of slurp out the stuff that I had kind of shaded in yellow there, you would create, a liquid, a magma that was high in SiO2, because all of the Mg and Fe had been sequestered away by these kind of green minerals down here. There was a very famous geologist named Bowen who did a bunch of experiments with cooling melts, and even though he did this 100 years ago, the results of his experiments still form the basis for our understanding of magma composition. And what he discovered was that fractional crystallization leads to changes in magma composition, as I was just describing. And more importantly, he was able to show that there is a very distinctive sequence of minerals that will crystallize from a magma. So if you have a hot ball of magma that contains all of the chemical elements, or all of the chemicals we had talked about before, of course it's going to have quite a bit of SiO2, because those are the most abundant elements. But then it's also going to have calcium, magnesium, iron, potassium, sodium, and maybe a few other elements, plus or minus volatiles. I guess I should include aluminum here because that's a big player. Okay, so you're going to have, these are the elements that you have to work with from which you can form minerals. And it turns out that as you take a melt and you slowly cool it down, the first ones to form will be olivine and pyroxene. These are the names of minerals that have abundant magnesium and iron in them, but not very much silica and oxygen, because these are mafic minerals. But as you allow your melt to progressively cool, then you can start to crystallize more and more felsic minerals, culminating in the most felsic minerals of all, which are these here. Okay, so not surprising, quartz, which has a chemical composition of SiO2, isn't one of those very felsic minerals. So igneous rocks can form both intrusively and extrusively. Of course, we've been saying that all along. Lava flows are a very common feature of extrusive settings. Okay, and that's because, of course, in the intrusive realm, you don't produce lava at all, you have magma. So once it gets to the surface, you can make lava flows. And what I meant to say was that mafic lava flows are common in extrusive settings. It's much easier to make a lava flow out of a mafic lava than it is out of a felsic lava, because mafic lavas are so much less viscous, so much runnier, that they can actually produce flows, whereas felsic magmas and felsic lavas tend to be much lower in temperature and much more viscous, and so therefore they're not runny. They don't tend to make flows like mafic lavas do. The picture on the right is a pretty cool picture. This is from Mount Vesuvius, and you can see in the picture that this is looking at kind of the interior wall of the volcano, that there are just tons of these lava flows. You can kind of make out this stripy pattern. This is a figure from your textbook, and the caption tells you that there are at least 50 lava flows that can be distinguished in this cliff. And for scale, these are people. Okay, felsic magmas, because they are so viscous and gummy, they tend to explode as ash eruptions. And we'll talk about this more when we discuss volcanoes next week. But ash is very, very tiny bits of glass. And glass can be a naturally occurring geologic material that quenches so quickly that it doesn't have time to form discrete mineral structures. So instead, it just freezes into kind of a frozen micro glob of whatever the chemicals were in the lava itself. These explosive ash eruptions can create pyroclastic flows. Pyroclastic flows are deadly avalanches of superheated volcanic ash and debris. And we looked at that very briefly in the last lecture that I showed. They race down the volcanic slope as a density current, moving on a carpet of hot air, much like how a snow avalanche works. But of course, these are superheated because they're volcanic, and they incinerate everything in their path. So it's actually pyroclastic flows that are kind of the deadly, lethal, dangerous thing about volcanic eruptions that we worry about, and that have been so destructive in the past. So the eruption that destroyed the city of Pompeii, the very historic and famous eruption, Pompeii was wiped out by a pyroclastic flow. There were huge, deadly pyroclastic flows that cascaded out of Mount St. Helens when it erupted famously 40 years ago now. What about the intrusive realm? So a lot of molten rock, the majority of it, never makes it to the surface where it gets erupted as a lava or as a pyroclastic cloud of ash. Much of it cools and crystallizes within the surface of the earth. And we can further subdivide intrusive igneous rocks based on their shape. So intrusive igneous rocks can be sheet-like, or they can be blob-like. We'll just call it like that for now. So on this slide, we're looking at the sheet-like, or sometimes called tabular, intrusive igneous forms that can develop in the intrusive realm. If the sheet-like igneous rock cuts across layers of wall rock, so in this picture here, we've got our layers of wall rock, and then we've got this thing that's cutting across them, that is vertical, then we call that a dike. And if we have a sheet-like intrusive igneous rock that injects between the pre-existing layers such that it is parallel to those layers, like I'm showing here, that would be called a sill. So dikes and sills are sheet-like or tabular intrusive igneous rocks. So in the picture of the woman sitting on the bench, we've got these pre-existing rocks that clearly have this these planar features like so. And then you can see that there is a sheet-like or tabular igneous rock that is cutting across those at a pretty high angle. So this would be an example of a dike. And in the picture on the right, this is from Antarctica. Hopefully you can see in this picture from a distance that there are rocks that have this really pronounced layering that I'm indicating here in yellow. And then this dark colored thing got injected between those layers. So this is a very massive sill. And sills and dikes can be anywhere from like a few centimeters all the way to meters or sometimes even kilometers in their thickness. And they can extend for many, many kilometers throughout the earth. What about the blob-like intrusive rocks? Well, not all magmas in the interior of the earth develop into these nice elongate sheet-like structures. Sometimes they crystallize to form these irregular-like blobs. Okay, and so you can think about these as being magma chambers that just kind of slowly solidify over time. And that's what's shown here in this top picture. So all of these purples, and then here's our active magma chamber here. These would have been previous magmas that cooled and solidified to make these blobs. So what I'm putting here in green are the contacts between these blobs. We could call each one of these blobs, if we wanted to, a pluton. That's the word that we give to an irregular blob-like intrusive igneous rock. These plutons or blobs there can be many of them that kind of inject into one another over long periods of time, like what's shown in this picture here. And we call an amalgamation of many, many plutons stitched together over a large area in the crust. We call that a batholith. Over time, what's shown here is the collection of these blob-like plutons forming at depth. Some of the magma that is in these chambers rises up and creates volcanoes here. Over time, erosion, however, is going to work to remove the volcanoes and the stuff over top, leaving behind, in this case, a dike. So this would be this feature here that has been eroded away. And of course, if you let enough time go on, you might expose this amalgamation of plutons, this batholith, you might erosionally expose it at the surface. And a very famous example of that is the Sierra Nevada batholith. Okay, this is like our hometown batholith. It runs the length of Eastern California here and has probably the most famous, one of the most famous national parks is in the Sierra Nevada batholith, Yosemite. And this is a picture from Yosemite Valley up here. And all of the kind of grayish white rocks that you see in this picture, pretty much everything, is a pluton of granite, which is an intrusive igneous rock. In fact, what you're probably seeing in the picture here are 10 or 20 or who knows how many plutons all stitched together to form this huge continuous igneous batholith, which presumably would have had volcanoes and all sorts of things on top of it, but those have been erosionally removed such that when you go walking around in Yosemite, you're standing on rocks that would have been in the mid-crust at some point when they formed and then got exhumed to the surface. So let's just recap for a second here, or it's not really a recap. Let's think about igneous rocks in terms of their textures, because when we go to classify igneous rocks, we're going to classify them based on their texture and on their composition. So let's think for a minute about texture. Igneous rocks that cool extrusively at the surface of the earth are going to have a very rapid cooling rate. And that's because the surface of the earth is a cold place. And so lava, when it comes out onto the surface of the earth, it's going to spill out and cover a large area. So lots of that lava is going to be exposed to the cold air, and that's going to cause it to cool very rapidly. In contrast, intrusive igneous rocks have very slow cooling rates because they are insulated by all of the warm rocks surrounding them. So intrusive igneous rocks cool slowly. extrusive igneous rocks cool very rapidly, and in some cases they cool so rapidly that minerals don't even get a chance to form, and so the lava just quenches into little droplets of ash. That means that the resulting igneous rock that forms, if it forms so rapidly that you don't even have a chance to, make minerals, then of course you'll produce an igneous rock that has a glassy texture because you're just making glass. Or you might produce minerals, but they'll be very, very tiny because they don't have time to grow and develop into larger crystals. So you'll produce an igneous rock that has a very fine-grained texture. Igneous rocks that cool intrusively, on the other hand, will have a very coarse-grained texture. And that's because the minerals have a nice long time to grow and develop into larger crystals because the rock is cooling slowly. So again, we're going to use that texture, fine and coarse, to help classify igneous rocks. So texture, and we're also going to use composition. And when we say composition, we really mean mafic versus felsic minerals. So felsic igneous rocks are going to be those that crystallize from a felsic magma or lava, and therefore contain a lot of those felsic or late crystallizing minerals that we saw in Bowen's reaction series. Things like quartz and potassium feldspar. Okay, so these minerals here, which by the way are kind of pink and gray, the resulting felsic igneous rocks therefore will have a somewhat pink and gray appearance like you're seeing here in the granite. Okay, so this is a very important slide, and I encourage you guys to spend a lot of time studying this slide, studying this figure from your textbook. It's very important. We're going to talk about it when we get together in class, but I want you to see if you can't figure out some of these relationships and how silica content, the higher the silica content, the lower the density, the lower the temperature. Okay, so you're going to produce these light colored rocks that have abundant felsic minerals in them. That light colored felsic rock, if it's coarse grained and cooled intrusively, would be called granite. If it's fine grained and cooled from a lava, we would call it rhyolite. We could look at the same example for a mafic rock. If it's only 50% SiO2, it will have a much higher density because instead of having SiO2, it's got magnesium and iron in it. This will have a much higher lava temperature, so the minerals that it contains are able to crystallize at higher temperatures. So they're not going to be quartz and feldspar. They're going to be some of those early crystallizing minerals like olivine and pyroxene, and therefore the resulting rock will have a dark black to maybe slightly greenish color, like the gabbro and the basalt that you're seeing here. Basalt is something that we've discussed. It's an extrusive mafic igneous rock. It has a very fine grained texture because it cools quickly at the surface of the earth. The interior or intrusive equivalent to basalt would be gabbro. This is what is underneath the crust in oceanic lithosphere. So again, I would say study this figure. It's a really important one, and we'll look at it together when we meet as a class. Bye-bye.